Hi, Izzie.
Hi, Katie. How are you?
Good. I'm so glad to have you here. And I've been waiting for this for a while. I'm really excited to finally get to hear your story because I feel like I feel like I
Yes.
know you so well. It's so funny how we have these relationships with people via Instagram and social media where I'm like, I feel like I know you, but I also I'm really excited to get a chance to just sit down with you for an hour and really kind of talk and pick
Definitely.
your brain.
Yes.
Um,
I'm excited too. It's a long time coming. A lot of your podcast has really helped navigate my ADHD journey. So I'm really grateful to finally be on the podcast.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, cool. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to ask you, first of all, how long ago you were diagnosed and what was happening in your life that you started started connecting the dots and thinking, really should look into this.
Yeah. So I received my diagnosis in October of last year. So that's 2021. So I'm a new diagnosis. I think it's been about what 6 or 7 months now. And yeah, my story that led up to my diagnosis is not uncommon. I will say that. I was a pandemic diagnosis, but I initially had sought out mental health services because of extreme burnout and anxiety. And I didn't quite understand what led to having so many problems as a result of the pandemic. I mean, it was, a complete, house of cards falling when the pandemic hit, with both of my boys going from being in school and then being home immediately. My husband not going into the office anymore. And then I had to shift my business completely. I'm a piano teacher and a music educator. I would be considered back then your friendly neighborhood piano teacher that all the kids would ride their bikes to my house and have piano after school. But that all changed. And, it really just left a gaping hole in what systems I had in place to manage daily life here in our home. So, with that, I was falling and falling further and further away from what I was comfortable with. I wasn't seeing people as often, as you know, with like social isolation due to the pandemic and things like that. A lot of the uncertainty also gave me tons of anxiety, trying to avoid getting sick and things like that, and keeping our elderly family members from getting sick. So, so many things just compounded, and having to shift my business from completely in person to completely online just added to the amount of stress and almost like a double-edged sword. Like, I got to use so much of my creativity, but it was also so much pressure to keep it going because I had such a dramatic loss of income at that time. So, it just kept going and kept going all through 2020 school year and summer 2020. Once I got into the fall of 2020, my husband and I made the decision to pull both of our children out of public school and homeschool them full time. So you can imagine how that, compounded with everything else, just added to that giant pile of responsibilities and roles and things that I had to be in charge of during that time. And little by little, like I said, I kept falling lower and lower and deeper into that hole. And things just hit a breaking point in May of 2021, where I was experiencing extreme burnout to the point where I was having crying spells daily, just unimaginable depression. I had fear of doing regular things like running errands to the grocery store. I was afraid that if I got on the highway, this was going to be it. An 18-wheeler was going to hit us and we were just going to die. Every little thing that I was doing was just putting me in a state of panic constantly. So with that, I made the decision to seek out mental health services. So I went to my primary care provider, who's a lovely doctor, very, very affirming and listens and does a wonderful job. And I just told her how I felt. You know, I took a couple battery tests and things like that. And she, you know, determined, okay, well, you have severe anxiety and depression as well. So she went ahead and prescribed me an antidepressant, anti-anxiety medicine. And, you know, I had never taken anything for my mental health before. So I had that, you know, internalized stigma and feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm a failure because I have to take medicine now. So trying to just get over that mountain was a struggle enough. So 2 weeks after I had gotten my prescription, I finally decided, okay, I will try this. So I tried the medicine and nothing happened. Nothing happened. I almost felt worse. It was like, it wasn't the right medicines. And I told myself, okay, I'll give myself 2 months to try this. And if nothing's working, then I'm going to go back to my doctor and tell her I need help. This is still not helping me. And at that point in time, I think it was closing in on like the first month of taking medicine. I was like, if this isn't working and I'm still having problems, then what the heck could this possibly be? I had no idea where to turn or begin. So I just started typing my symptoms and, you know, trying to research on my own. And I had seen a few things on social media that were resonating. And I did have a couple Facebook friends of mine who have ADHD, and they post regularly about their experiences. I started to relate to one of my Facebook friends' posts. She's also a music teacher as well. And she was, you know, talking about her experience through the pandemic as well. And I was just resonating with a lot of what she was saying. So I figured, okay, well, this is random, but let me just look up a little bit more about ADHD. I had no idea that it could be diagnosed as an adult. I had no idea that there was such a stark contrast in diagnoses in boys versus girls and women. I didn't know any of this. I had no knowledge of this before. So as I, you know, dove deeper into ADHD and realizing that maybe perhaps this is what I'm dealing with instead, that's when I finally mentioned it to my primary care provider at my follow-up. Yes. And she was very curious and, you know, didn't necessarily have ADHD on her radar for me because she had seen so many women dealing with anxiety and depression heightened during the pandemic. So she really appreciated the fact that I did some research. I did my own journaling and things like that, just to have a more retrospective view of how ADHD may have been presenting itself in my past. And she went ahead and decided, you know, I may not be the best person to diagnose and treat you for ADHD, but I know someone who can. So she sent me to a PhD behavioral nurse practitioner who was also an ADHD specialist. So once I finally saw that doctor, she was phenomenal. And I actually shouldn't use past tense. She is phenomenal because I'm still seeing her. It's incredible to be able to have neuro-affirming providers that listen and that really care for their patients. And the fact that she never, ever took anything that I said and tossed it aside. She took what I said. She looked at my journal. She listened. She took everything that I presented to her as evidence for her reports in figuring out my diagnoses. So after 3 months of working with her on various appointments and interviews and journaling, she did come to the conclusion that I had inattentive type ADHD, which made perfect sense. Everything that I had gone through, ADHD provided a textbook clinical answer to what I was going through. So that's my very long and colorful journey to my diagnosis.
I'm so glad you had a positive experience. I did as well. And it wasn't until I started this podcast and really kind of started and heard from other women about their own experiences of being minimized in the doctor's office, how rampant, not only how rampant it is, but also just that cycle of being dismissed as being depressed and anxious, and that's it, and being turned away, and how that level of dismissal is so damaging when you have ADHD, right? and how it's so important for clinicians to realize how much, how curious they need to be, I guess, or, like how damaging it can be to sort of decide on behalf of the patient what they have. You know what I mean? Like,
yes, absolutely. I agree with you there. I think that providers have a ton of power in, really transforming that doctor-patient relationship when they actually take the time to listen and affirm their patients. As a patient, we're coming to them in a vulnerable position, wanting their expert opinion on what we're going through, listening to stories of patients. We should be listening and really understanding that these are our experiences, our lived experiences, and they are 100% valid. We may not fit the criteria for your ADHD textbook, young hyperactive boy. Mm-hmm. We may not. We're women. We're complex and beautiful creatures that, are experiencing life through a different lens, and just being able to understand and accept that, we may not be the typical presentation will help keep us going on that ADHD journey. Mm-hmm. Hopefully a positive journey.
Right? Yeah. Now you have a graduate degree in psychology, right?
I do, actually. It's funny. My bachelor's degree is in psychology and human development and family studies, and my master's degree is in industrial organizational psychology. So,
okay, interesting.
It's a little different. It's like psychology of the workplace, psychology of organizations as a whole. So you could tell that the elements of like human behavior has always been of interest to me. But when deciding my graduate degree, I wasn't totally sure if I wanted to become a clinician myself. So I figured it may make more sense for me to be able to apply, my studies of human behavior to a larger setting. So I got to practice that in my my work when I did work. Not as an entrepreneur. I worked in employee training. I also worked in leadership. Mm-hmm. So, just trying to apply my expertise and my knowledge to organizations was an asset to my organization when I was working there. So,
yeah. I guess, is it surprising to you with your background how little is known or talked about in the medical profession about ADHD and neurodiversity?
It's something that definitely, I feel like there's just a big hole in the literature, in the research, especially when it pertains to women and our experiences. Something of interest that I know many people have talked about before is experiences of neurodiverse women in the workplace and, in corporate America and things like that. It's their experiences, a lot of times they can be written off as too emotional or too bombastic or too impulsive when it comes to working in that corporate environment, that patriarchal corporate environment that's perpetuated across the, actually across the world. I know my experience in working, I absolutely was written off as the too emotional one and called out. It was actually a very damaging experience to me as a professional, because all I did at that time was point out weaknesses in one of our programs, right? But I managed to do it in an environment full of men that they were just not happy with the fact that I had the guts to point this out, even though that was my job.
Yeah.
They just didn't like to be called out. But part of that, I'm sure my delivery was full of lovely emotional words and things like that. But, with ADHD and undiagnosed ADHD at that point, I had no filter when it came to finding these weaknesses and presenting them, because I thought, okay, this is exactly what they want me to do. I'm telling them exactly what the issue is, how to solve it. But they weren't comfortable with it. So it's funny how those things work out. So.
I know, right? And that's why I get I feel like a broken record when I talk about this on the podcast about, what are we even talking about with ADHD? Because so much of it seems like, this, it only affects you negatively when you're in these environments where you have a failure to kind of stay in your place and conform and go with the flow, and all of these ways in which I talk about it. I love the newspaper industry. I felt like it was perfect for my brain. It makes so much sense why I was a journalist and how much I loved about it. But I often would leave a newspaper every 2 years because of some outburst or some conflict with a boss, and I would just couldn't handle it anymore. So much incompetence here or there, and it was a lot of that, like you said, that impulsivity and the inability to not kind of authentically share my thoughts about things. But a lot of the time it is, when you look back and you think about children and the classroom and then being in workplace environments where it's it's the inability to kind of stay in line a lot of the time. Right. And then we end up being labeled with a disorder as a result.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of it I felt that was my attempt at the time to unmask, in an environment where I felt that my expertise and my professionalism was valued, when it was a ruse, right? They didn't provide that environment where it was safe for me to unmask. Even though I perceived it as a place like that. So after an incident like that, of course, as an ADHDer, you are afraid to unmask then. So you put it on even tighter and you just say, okay,
you retreat.
That was a bad idea. I'm not doing that anymore. And then you fade into the background again. And your potential to help so many different things. But if you're not comfortable in your own skin, it's really hard to just, be yourself. And it's unfortunate that many workplaces don't provide a safe space to unmask and to be full authentic self. You know.
And why so many of us end up becoming self-employed. So, right? I know. Okay, so I'm curious with your background in music, and I know you come from a very musical family, like it must have been so fascinating to you after your diagnosis to go over go over your whole life the way we do with this new lens. And
Absolutely.
so I'm curious, not only, what are some of the things that you look back at and think, oh my goodness, the signs were there all along, but also, looking at your family members, like how have you talked about it with your family and what has their reaction been? Because I'm sure it's probably all over the place in your family as if you come from musicians. So, but yeah, look at what are some of the things where you look back and you're like, oh yeah, the signs were there all along.
Yeah. Growing up in a very traditional Latino Catholic family, it was very hard to express any sort of issues with emotion, mental health, any sort of differences that you may be dealing with. A lot of times, there's a couple sayings in Spanish, that, they perpetuate in our culture. And one of my friends, Andrea, recently reminded me of a very popular one. It's called Calladita es más bonita. And calladita means silence and bonita is pretty, right? So calladita es más bonita. If you're silent, you'll be prettier, right? It's like, the ability to be yourself is not necessarily something that is encouraged in Latino culture. They want you to work. They want you to keep a perfect house. They want you to do everything you can to keep a good family life. And anything that goes beyond that or outside of the norm for our culture is completely dismissed or put away. I like the movie Encanto for this reason. The popular song, We Don't Talk About Bruno. Well, I sort of look at Bruno as a metaphor for mental health in the Latino culture. We don't talk about Bruno because Bruno is bad. Bruno is someone we put away. We don't talk about these things in our culture. And the stigma is still there today. Even now, like, there are families out there that, they don't even want to think of the idea that their child might be different or, outside of what is acceptable in our culture. So it makes it very hard to be yourself, to be an authentic person in our family even. And that's really hard. In my family in particular, mental health was not something that was ever talked about, ever, right? So, when I was starting to deal with all of the issues that I had as a teen, all of my emotional outbursts, I had terrible emotional dysregulation. I was going through disordered eating, really lots of trouble with rejection sensitive dysphoria. I just was having such a hard time. It was chalked up to, oh, it's hormones and she needs to go to church. So you could probably imagine that, my relationship with the Catholic Church is not really there anymore because I just have such a negative association with what they represent at this point in time. But it's something that in our culture is a beautiful culture. I will say that. We're very loving, like fiercely loyal people. But a lot of times, the stigma and the heaviness of mental health issues, if that loving, safe, supportive environment was there for something like mental health, to have that that trusting relationship between children and their parents or their grandparents, I feel like we would be doing so much more healing before, things get to a point where it explodes, right? So that's definitely something that was prevalent in my background. Probably one of the most telling signs for me for ADHD growing up was the fact that I went to 3 different universities and changed my major like 7 times. I started out as a music major, of course. With my background in music, I began piano when I was 4 years old. My mother was my first teacher, and I would be considered a 3rd generation piano teacher at this point. But even though I started out as a music major, I could not decide what in music to do. So I started out and auditioned as a flute major, flute performance. And then I decided, okay, I don't want to do flute performance anymore. I'm going to switch to vocal performance. And I said, okay, well, I auditioned and I made that. I got into the vocal performance program. And then I said, wait a second, this is going to be really hard to sustain. So let me switch to music education. So I switched, and then I just could not figure it out. I couldn't decide. I ended up leaving that university and moving back home, switched to another university. I figured, okay, well, what about something like Spanish? I can do Spanish, business Spanish or something of the sort, right? So I started doing coursework in Spanish, and I did fine, but I was not happy. At that point in time, I took a sabbatical, of course, who doesn't take a sabbatical when you are as indecisive as an ADHDer in college? So I took a year off and I moved to Mexico. I lived in Cuernavaca in the state of Morelos, which is about an hour south of Mexico City. And I taught English, and I loved teaching. I realized that I had a natural affinity for educating. I just really was very highly invested in the student, the learner. I loved the process of teaching. And I really enjoyed seeing them light up when they achieved something. That was like the best feeling in the world. So with that experience teaching English in Mexico, and after I ran out of money, I took a one-way ticket back home, and I decided, okay, well, I have no idea what I want to be still, but I know I want to help people. That was like the general umbrella. I want to help people, and I'm pretty good at this teaching thing. So with all the colorful courses and coming from all different universities, I ended up at the University of Houston, and I opted for a psychology degree with a minor in human development and family studies, which I thought was actually appropriate because I was, again, fascinated by human behavior, the brain. I loved my abnormal psych classes, personality psych. I just had a really good time. Developmental psych, I learned about twice exceptionality. I learned about ADHD. I learned about autism. It was very fascinating things. So with that bachelor's degree that I finally earned, I felt like I was in a good spot in terms of the degree. Now, in terms of a job, I still had no clue. Well, my first job out of college was quite interesting. I was actually a rehabilitation specialist for the blind and visually impaired. So I worked at the Lighthouse of Houston, and I loved that approach, working one-on-one with a visually impaired or a blind person. A client would come in needing some training on assistive technology or screen reading technology, and I would help them learn the keystrokes and the patterns and everything that they needed to do for vocational training or work in school to do their schoolwork. So that was something that was very rewarding. Yeah, I mean, I could go into all the different jobs that I've done.
I know, right?
But
Our resumes are always so fascinating.
they're full of all kinds of stuff. So, but yeah, it continues on from there. That's when I finally made the switch over to working in human resources and employee training, and then pursuing my master's degree. So, yeah.
So are you still homeschooling? Because you have two, how old are your little ones? They're pretty small still, right?
Yeah, my youngest just turned 6 and my oldest is about to be 9.
Oh, okay.
And they are not homeschooling anymore. After my burnout last summer, my husband and I made the good decision to put them back into public school, which I think was timely and appropriate. They have blossomed tremendously in school. They love their teachers. They've made some good friends, which is what I was mostly concerned about, was making sure that they had that exposure and the chance to have friends and to have disagreements with friends and see what it's like working with teachers that are not your mom. So they're thriving. They're doing very well. And we just finished our school year here about a week and a half ago. So we are in summer mode now. So, yes.
And so I'm curious, do you think either of them have ADHD? I know because so many women come to their diagnosis through their kids. I wasn't one of those women, neither are you. So I'm like, and all I do is watch my kids being like, is it, isn't it, is it? Yeah.
Yeah. So after I received my diagnosis and I started hyper focusing on ADHD and learning all I could about it, my husband and I both recognized lots and lots of traits in our eldest son, specifically inattentive traits, not keeping focus, daydreaming constantly, executive dysfunction. We try to give him, chores and tasks broken down into micro steps to try and get him to complete those tasks, taking abnormally long time to complete certain things. And so that sort of sparked his diagnosis journey. And we talked with his pediatrician first. And I mentioned my diagnoses, which she was fascinated about, and seeing how my diagnoses sort of led to us journaling and figuring out that he was also presenting as inattentive type as well. So that sort of led into pursuing a 504 for him in school. His teacher also completed her part of the assessment for ADHD, the Vanderbilt assessment, and she agreed wholeheartedly with that same conclusion. She's a 25-year veteran teacher, and she immediately knew. She says, I'm so happy that you are pursuing these things for him because this is only going to help him in the future. So good on you, Mom and Dad, for working hard to support and advocate for him. So she was a wonderful second grade teacher to work with. And she absolutely, with our 504 meetings, was able to work on making those accommodations necessary for him in his class. He's not medicated. We don't have plans to medicate him until it's absolutely necessary. And I think that's the right decision since we're just now getting our feet wet in the ADHD world for him. So, and for me too. But, for him, especially as a child, he's still figuring things out, trying to find what strategies are working for him when it comes to schoolwork and social life and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, but, it's fluid. We're working and with his pediatrician and his probably his third grade teacher coming up, just to make sure that he's got everything that he needs to succeed.
Yeah,
So
I know, right?
yeah.
So much of this is advocating and teaching them self-advocacy,
Yes.
and right.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, okay, so let's talk about your Instagram account, because, I sort of feel like, you've said to me in the past that you started it as just like a way for you to do research, right? And I kind of relate to that, because this podcast was the same way. I started this podcast because I was like, I want to learn about ADHD and I want to find out other people's experiences. And then I was like, oh my goodness, people are actually listening to this. And
Yes.
and so I feel like it must be fascinating to you to kind of have this platform now, from this journey of like
Self-discovery.
self-discovery, self-realization, and now becoming
Yes.
this voice for other women.
It's quite cool. It was never the intention, as you very well know. I started my Instagram account, Izzie and ADHD, as a purely research-based journal, digital journal, if you say, to document what I've learned, and sort of treat it as like I'm in ADHD school or something, right? I love little projects. I'm one of those forever student types. If I could be a professional student, I would just go to classes and just write papers. Like, that's just how my brain operates and things like that. So when I started this account, it was being treated as such. So anytime I would learn something, I would say, okay, well, the best way for me to show that I've learned something is to present it in a form or fashion. And in this case, my chosen medium was the reel. So 15 to 30 seconds, I would record something, and I would just write those strategies or those tips or those things that I had learned about that specific chosen topic, and present it in a way that was catchy, easy to remember, and may help in the future, right? So I could reference it later. Well, apparently the way I have constructed these reels is also very helpful for other people. Surprise, surprise. So my reels caught on very quickly. My account is only 6 months old. And, I had some good growth at the beginning that was consistent, a nice little climb, right? And then when I got to, I think it was the month of February, or maybe it was March. I think it was March. I had explosive growth, exponential, something like, my reach was going from like 200,000 to 2 million. It was just something I had never had before, right? I kept telling myself like, oh, this would be great if it was on my actual business page. I was like, every now and then I'll type in like, go like my actual business. So, but every now and then, people pop in, they're like, oh, you're a piano teacher. That's awesome. And then they'll go over there. But yeah, that the ADHD account was never meant to be the platform that it has become. But, just realizing that the way I present this information and my personal experiences with ADHD and symptoms, it's so relatable that I found it almost to be a responsibility to keep it going, because we learn new things every single day about ourselves. We have experiences that we wonder, oh, is someone else going through something similar as me? And you want to be able to honestly present that in a way that another person could find solace, could feel less alone. And with the creative explosion of something like Reels, it reaches so many people who may be looking exactly for the type of creator that I am. I'm a no frills Texas entrepreneurial ADHD mom, Latina, and I don't hide any of who I am. What you see is what you get. And, just keeping the authenticity going, I feel is important, just to give people the courage to be authentic themselves and embrace what, newly diagnosed neurodivergent feels like. You want to be able to wholly accept who you are, without any sort of doubt. So I just try to communicate that to the best of my ability.
It is so empowering and freeing, right? I mean, first of all, it makes sense to me as a teacher that you have sort of used this medium as your motivation to learn. You use teaching as your motivation to learn, right? Which is so fascinating. Exactly. And I kind of relate to that too. As a journalist, one thing I always loved about interviewing people and writing about a topic was that I had to learn as much as possible in a very short period of time about something.
Yes.
And then I had to be able to explain it to somebody who maybe had never heard of it before. So I had to be really kind of get to what is the meat of this topic? What's the hook? What's really the most interesting part? And I loved that. I loved everything about it. And it was an excuse for me to learn random things. And, right. And so I love the fact that that's kind of your motivation, because that's also something I talk about with my coaching clients a lot, which is getting in touch with what's going to motivate you. And I always use the example of the time-lapse cleaning videos where I'm people use time-lapse cleaning videos to clean their kitchen, and then they post them as though it's a service to other people to watch them clean, being watch me clean. And it's nobody care. I mean, great. It's interesting and fascinating that you're cleaning, but good for you for figuring out a way to clean your own kitchen, which is I don't want to clean my kitchen, but if I turn it into a reel and a production and make a caption and all this stuff, it's going to get me to do the thing. And so I'm whatever works, right? Just figure out how you're going to tap into whatever motivation you need to do those things. And so,
absolutely.
But it's also, but like you said, that then people are relating to that authenticity, which I think can be so empowering. I just, when you've felt your whole life like a hot mess, and then you talk openly about what a hot mess you are, and people relate to that, I just feel it's everybody benefits, right? And
absolutely.
And I don't know. I know a lot of people do get kind of negative comments and trolls. I'm always surprised at how few I get. But then I've also kind of put up, I don't let people comment on my stuff anymore unless they follow me, because I was so tired of all of that bullshit of all of those comments of ADHD isn't real and all that stupid stuff. So I put up a lot of boundaries around my content. Good. But I think for the most part, it's so rewarding, right? To be able to share these parts of yourself that you might have otherwise hid for a long time in shame, and to be able to help other people to feel better about themselves. It's incredible.
Yes. The trolls exist, but I have experience with trolls from my YouTube channel and teaching piano.
Really?
Yes, surprisingly, they find a way. I had to stop doing live streams on YouTube because I had people in a children's piano lesson coming in and putting middle finger emojis and curse words. I'm this is a kid's class. Please go away.
Oh, God.
So I stopped doing live streams, but I was I need to put up some very firm boundaries for my content. And with my ADHD page and my ADHD content, I think that's why a lot of times the comments and things like that are just roll off of me, because I'm just okay.
Yeah.
And I took the opportunity, I think a couple months back, to get some of the golden nuggets of troll comments and made a very funny reel about it. And it's if you're going to send me that stuff, I'm going to use it. And the more you engage with it, the more people see my stuff. So it's a win-win for me.
True.
Send me all you want if you want. I mean, it either gets deleted or blocked, or I make something funny about it. So
yeah, I know. I usually delete them immediately, and then I'm very grateful for poor working memory, because I don't spend I don't spend any time thinking about it if I delete it immediately. It's only when I like try to think about how I would respond to that it kind of like, I don't know, like imprints on me, and then I ruminate about it forever. And so I'm like, my way of dealing with that is just like, nope, immediately gone.
It's like immediately gone. And it's like, if you delete it fast enough, it's like it didn't exist.
Right? I think so. Yeah.
It's fine.
It's like the 5-second rule with food, right?
Exactly. There you go. We call it the 5-minute Instagram rule. If the notification comes in and it's something trashy, if within 5 minutes, if you delete it, didn't exist.
I love that. Makes sense.
So anyway.
So in addition to your creativity with this account, and I mean, it's sort of launching you, you've started a community, and are you doing some coaching? Like what's changed for you? This really is sort of, you're on this whole new path now as an ADHD educator and advocate, right?
Yeah. It's been interesting, since it's so new. And since I have experience in building communities, I have my very robust virtual piano learning community. Now I have, tomorrow, June 6th, we're actually launching our Weird and Wonderful ADHD community on Discord. I love Discord because it's off of your big social media platforms. I can get it nice and cutesy and a little bit strange and fun. It just feels like home in terms of a digital place for me. So I did launch that community, and we do have, it's sort of like a small membership program too. I'm not offering any sort of coaching. I don't have any certifications for coaching or anything like that, but I am happy to refer people to very successful coaches that are out there. But my membership program is basically to help keep the community running and to be able to incorporate guest speakers for my highest level members. So every month I'm paying to get a speaker to come in and do a presentation and a Q&A for an hour for my members on topics that may be of really big interest to them. And to have the access to that expert in that field is just something that, gosh, it's really helpful. So that's sort of the motivation behind the membership program as a whole. It's to create community, but then also to give access to some good resources in experts out there.
Yeah.
So, it's less about me making money. It's really not. It's just to run our community.
I know.
And more about getting them the resources that they need. So.
Yeah. And I talk about that all the time on the podcast about finding your community and finding your people is such a huge part of our journey and our treatment. And, that's when I started my online community for the same reason, where it was like, I'm meeting all of these incredible women and realizing how that connection, even if it's fleeting, even if it's just like a 1-hour conversation, it's so healing, because we speak this language and we share in a way that is so, we just like cut through the small talk and we get right to like the trauma. I just feel like I just want everybody to meet each other, right? Like I just kind of want to be able to sort of facilitate, even though ADHD women are often like herding cats. It's also like, I just want to be able to facilitate a way in which people can come together and find those resources and have those moments of like, oh my God, does anybody else experience this? Or, these like moments of panic. And I felt like when I first was diagnosed, I joined like every Facebook group I could think of and was like, oh, always in there and reading all of these things and realizing how much of my own learning was coming from those conversations and not from like reading articles in Attitude magazine. I mean, Attitude magazine is an incredibly helpful resource. There's a lot there,
Right.
but usually it was like, going down these rabbit holes and finding these conversations and the shared how important it is to feel, like you said, like we're not alone in these experiences and we're not crazy. And what that, so yeah, right. Like it was only realizing through my own experience after my diagnosis and all the things I sought out, having to like sit and think about like why I sought those particular learning resources out as opposed to, buying. I mean, I listen to a lot of audiobooks too, and like the Tracy Otsuko podcast was so formative for me in the beginning. But yeah, you start to learn of like why are these certain resources more effective than others, right? And how am I as a learner? And yeah, anyway, so that's awesome. So it's fantastic that this is, introduced, like that so much good has come from this diagnosis, right? Because I always say like nobody comes to their ADHD diagnosis being like, my life is great, I wish I had a name for this superpower of mine. Right? Like,
yeah, it's like that meme of like the dog sitting in the chair but the house is on fire and he's got the coffee mug and says everything's fine. It's like,
yeah,
it's like clearly it's not.
I know, right? Yeah, like usually we're in like a state of crisis or something. Yeah, so it is so amazing to see how this diagnosis can completely transform our view of ourselves and even just sort of our next path, our next where we go with that. So
definitely,
I'd love to ask what if you could rename ADHD to something that's a little less confusing, would you call it something else?
Yeah, I thought about this one a lot because all the acronyms and names that I came up with were so long. I was like, no, I can't. It's too long. I got to shorten it. So what I came up with was attention and emotion regulation disorder. So the reason being, obviously, is attention regulation. A lot of times it's hard to prioritize our attention on the things that absolutely need our attention at that certain point in time, right? Same thing with, misperception of time, right? I'm on a mission also to, as an aside, to change the term time blindness because I find it ableist.
Okay.
We're co-opting the term blindness from the blind community, and I don't think it's appropriate. So I like to use misperception of time. So when I refer to it in my reels and my posts, I always use misperception of time.
I really appreciate that clarification. I don't think it's something I would have picked up on, but yeah, I really haven't given your experience. That's really important to know. And I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. With my history working with the blind and visually impaired, I just want to make sure that I'm honoring that community.
Yeah.
So back to the naming, yes, emotion regulation. I like to include that too, because I feel like a lot of the bigger issues like RSD really are not given the focus in the name as much as it should.
There's nothing in the DSM about emotions.
I know. Yeah. So I think it's important to, name that, because many ADHDers are dealing with such emotional dysregulation and rejection sensitivity. It's such a big part in why many of us are people pleasers, why we have such terrible boundaries. They're all interconnected. So I felt that it was important to include emotion regulation as well. And then, the term hyperactive, we all know that hyperactivity can be external or internal, but I don't necessarily feel like it's as prominent in needing to be in the title as something like attention and emotion. So that's my own interpretation, but
yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And then the disorder part, some people, women I've interviewed, really want to keep the term disorder because of how helpful it is in terms of getting accommodations and sort of taking this seriously as something that can be incredibly debilitating when not treated. But at the same, but then there's the other side of the coin, which is like, this isn't a disorder. Like, this is just, this is a neurodivergent brain. And, why are we pathologizing our weird and wonderfulness? So I see both sides.
Yeah. Me specifically, I think that keeping the word disorder is important on the accommodation side. In the DSM, I don't see things like phenomenon or, condition. Like, there's reasons why there are clinical terms in there is so that we are able to get the help and accommodations that we need. I don't take a big issue with the word disorder. It's the opposite of order, right? So as long as we are able to get the accommodations that are necessary for us to function in a daily life, then I think that's okay with me. So.
I agree. Yeah. Okay. So are you still teaching? You're still teaching music? Like, how can people find you and work with you? And I'll put a link to your Instagram, obviously, and your community. But are you still taking new students?
Yeah. So how my virtual piano lessons work is I operate a Patreon page. You can search patreon.com/Izzie Chea. And you'll find my programs that I teach from. I teach 4 different programs for very young children, children 7 to 12, and adults and teens. And I also have an intermediate series. And all of those lessons are connected to my YouTube channel and my Discord server for virtual piano. So in terms of private students, I'm not taking new private students because I have a waiting list 75 people deep.
Wow.
So if you want private lessons with me, it might be around 2 to 2.5 years before you can start. You're free to still be added to the waiting list. And I have people that are still actively pursuing that, but it might be a while. So the best thing to do if you want to experience my neurodivergent brain, my music education passion, is to find me on YouTube. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. It gives new meaning to the friendly neighborhood piano teacher.
Right? It's like my neighborhood has gotten so much bigger. So, still friendly.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So, I watched the video, your introduction video on your music page, and seeing all the kids at the end saying like, "We love you, Miss Chea. Thank you." It was so Mrs. Izzie. Yeah. I love it. Miss Izzie. Yeah. It was so sweet. It was really, I mean, I can see why they love you and why you're such a great teacher. You just have such a relatable, friendly energy about you that is contagious, and it definitely comes out in your reels, but in sort of all the different medium that you do. It's it was very touching.
Thanks so much. Yeah, they're the reason why I do what I do. Seeing their faces light up when they play through a song that they've had so much trouble with, and they just they just burst with excitement. We have 1-second parties. We celebrate all the little wins that we have in our music. I've carried over 1-second parties to executive function issues here with ADHD. Like, I started mentioning all that to my followers too, and they're like, "Oh, what is that? Tell me about a 1-second party." So I explained it in the context of like homework help for my ADHD son. We incorporate these little cheers and wins. We have like the cha-cha. We have the jalapeno. We have all kinds of silly little things, but it helps, celebrating little wins is a big reason why we can be successful. So
Yeah. Aw, I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with me, Izzie. I was so glad to be able to interview you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.